Good morning, everyone. I hope that you're having a great day. And I said good morning, which may not be morning for you, but it is for me. And today we're going to talk about energy balance, weight control, and also talk about the 7 dimensions of wellness. So just remember that that quiz is due before class, um, and that it's going to shut you out if you don't take it. So you got to take it before class starts. So 2 birds are sitting on a perch and one looks at the other and says, "Do you smell fish?" If you don't get that joke, that can be the question that you bring to class, all right? Okay, let's talk about energy balance and weight control first. So it's not a secret that Americans are getting fatter, although the rate of obesity seems to have leveled off somewhat. But from ages 20 to 40, Americans tend to gain about 2 pounds per year. So if you do 2 pounds per year across 20 years, then that's a lot of added weight by the time you reach your 40s or so. And why does that happen? Generally, it comes down to that energy intake chronically exceeds the expenditure, taking in more calories than we expend. And compared to 1970, women tend to eat about 335 more calories per day, and men about 168 calories per day. And if you look at that and you say, well, if energy intake exceeds by 335 calories per day, then if you do the math with 3,500 calories being a pound, which is debatable, but that would be about 30 pounds in a year, which is not what we see. We see about 2 pounds per year. So what happens, we'll talk about this a little later in the lecture, is that you have changes in your metabolic rate depending on what size your body is. So your body doesn't perfectly store every calorie that it doesn't use. There's some balance in the system. If you look at that panel on the right there, it breaks down about how much per day people are eating in Americans are eating on average in the different food groups. And if you look at caloric sweeteners, 444 calories, that's where a lot of the added calories compared to back in the 70s is coming from. A lot more calories from added sugar, added sweeteners than there used to be. And if you look there at panel B on the bottom, you have the recommendation level with that white line, and then the actual percentage of that most Americans are eating. So it's not super surprising. We eat a lot of meat and grains, not quite enough dairy, fruits, and vegetables. But we'll talk about protein in a little bit, and that these recommendations are current, but they're maybe not the most up to date that we could have. When we look at obesity, there is the chronic intake of calories that exceeds expenditure, that there is some genetic susceptibility to obesity. So if you have seen the picture of these 2 mice on the right-hand side, on the left you have a very obese mouse, on the right you have a normal weight mouse, and the mouse on the left, the big fat mouse, has a genetic mutation that's been programmed into it. That's the OB mutation. And these mice can't produce leptin. And leptin is the hormone that tells your body that you're full, tells your brain that you're not hungry. So in the OB mouse, that there is no leptin, so you can't get that signal from your fat cells to your brain to say you're not hungry. You just have ghrelin, and if you're ghrelin, Grelin, that's the one that says you're hungry. So all you have is ghrelin telling you you're hungry, you're hungry, you're hungry, and nothing telling you you're full, you're good. So they have a genetic predisposition to being obese. Other than that, there are epigenetic changes. Epigenetics is what happens based on your lifestyle choices. There are changes in your genetics, how your body processes things based on some of your behavioral choices, and also somewhat related to environment. So an epigenetic example of susceptibility would be that a child who is a child of obese parents, if one or both parents is obese, they have double the risk of being obese. So that would be an example of epigenetic changes. In our environment, we, especially in America, have an obesity-producing environment. We have continuous access to inexpensive, large portion, high-calorie, good-tasting food, and so people who are genetically susceptible tend to gain more weight. Our environment also is not set up for a lot of physical activity. We drive cars, we use segways, use those cool little circle things that you stand on. We kind of do anything to avoid walking someplace. So our environment is also not set up for a lot of activity. So between having a lot of high calorie, yummy, low nutrient density foods around and not being a very physically active society, you end up with that predisposition to gain weight. There are also some racial differences. One of the most consistent things we've seen is that Black women tend to have a lower resting energy expenditure and lower physical activity expenditure. So because they have a lower amount of calories every day that they expend just for basic functions and a lower physical activity level, then they're more likely to gain weight. There's also some evolutionary differences here. Um, you'll hear the term being metabolically thrifty. So that's stating that some people are better at storing calories than others. And back in the day, like caveman times, that meant that you could keep some more energy stores on board and be able to make it through a famine or a time of little food better than somebody who is not good at storing extra energy. So that would be a metabolically thrifty person who holds a lot more calories in store than someone who doesn't, which back in the day was a good thing and today is not. We talked about daily energy expenditure for just a second back there, but you have several components of your total daily energy expenditure. These four are the agreed upon components. The thermic effect of food, so that's talking about how much energy it takes just to digest your food. Exercise activity thermogenesis, or EAT, that's how many calories you're expending through your exercise activity, not to be confused with NEAT or non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So that's stuff like getting up and down up off of your chair, walking up and down the stairs, pushing a vacuum, cleaning. It does actually take some extra energy to do things like drive. That would all fall under non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And then basal metabolic rate, I want to differentiate here between basal metabolic rate and resting metabolic rate. So your basal metabolic rate is the energetic cost of the biological processes required for survival at rest. So it's going to be after an overnight fast with nothing in your guts. You're laying down quietly with no psychological stimulation. It's just how many calories do you need to actually keep you alive. Your resting metabolic rate is still in a fasted state, but it can be at any time of the day and you just have to be resting and not stimulated by anything. It tends to be about 3 to 10% higher than basal metabolic rate. So if you can remember that difference between basal metabolic rate and resting metabolic rate. And here we'll talk about resting metabolic rate. It accounts for about 60 to 70% of your total daily energy expenditure. On this chart, it says your BMR accounts for 60 to 70% of total energy expenditure. It's close enough. Your resting metabolic rate is going to be a little bit higher. And you can see sort of the breakdown here on this chart that exercise activity is going to be about 15% of your total expenditure, non-exercise activity 15 to 50% depending on what do you do for a living, how do you get to and from work, what's your daily schedule, are you sitting at a desk or do you have a more active job, and so on. And these are averages. So for exercise activity, if you're a highly trained and training athlete who's training for several hours every day at relatively high intensities, then obviously your exercise activity thermogenesis is going to be much higher and will take up a greater percent of your total daily energy expenditure. And the thermic effect of food we'll talk about in a minute, but about which types of food take more energy to break down than others. Here's a further breakdown of resting metabolic rate. This is an example for if somebody is eating 2,000 calories a day. This would be the number of calories burned by the different components of resting metabolic rate. I'm sorry, this is 1,645 calories consumed. Let me back up. For somebody who's eating 2,000 calories per day, a 70 kilogram person, about 1,645 calories will go to resting metabolic rate. So trust me, the percentage works out there. And this graph shows the number of calories that would be consumed by the different components of resting metabolic rate. So your muscles, your liver, and your brain are the greatest consumers. And then your heart and your kidneys take up a lot. Your adipose tissue takes up a lot. And then the bone, skin, intestines, endocrine is sort of qualified under other. Altogether, it adds up to quite a bit. But really the processes that keep you alive all day really do take up a lot of energy. And I just want to mention, you'll probably hear that it's good to gain lean mass because the more muscle mass you have, the more energy you burn at rest. This is true to an extent. It doesn't make a gigantic difference. So for the addition of 5 kilograms of muscle mass, so that's a little over 10 pounds, it's only going to increase your resting energy expenditure by about 65 calories per day. So 65 calories doesn't make a really big difference in either direction. It is still metabolically advantageous to have more muscle because it's better than having more fat for other health reasons, not just for your resting energy expenditure. What happens with exercise? If you add more exercise to your exercise, if you add more exercise, your exercise activity thermogenesis is going to go up. So this is that average breakdown again, basal metabolic rate, right at the top of that, at the low end of the scale, 61% here. Your non-exercise activity thermogenesis about 15%. Exercise activity thermogenesis at 16 and thermic effect of food at 8, then your exercise activity thermogenesis comes out to about 320 calories, which is about 30 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity for somebody who's about 70 to 75 kilos. And one of the terms that you'll see in your textbook is this PAL, your physical activity level. Your physical activity level is the ratio of your BMR to the sum of the thermic effect of food, exercise activity thermogenesis, and non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So you'd have your BMR total divided by the total of everything else. And this example, you'd have a physical activity level of 1.56. There's no specific recommendations given in your book other than for maintaining weight or maintaining weight loss, and those recommendations go up to actually 1.8. But that's a new concept for me. I just wanted to mention that there because there's a possibility that's going to catch on. Another thing I wanted to mention is with exercise, there is a short-term or transient increase in resting metabolic rate after exercise. If you remember the term EPOC, EPOC, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, means your body is still using more energy to recover from exercise after you're done. It's not that your resting metabolic rate goes back down to total rest right after you're done. That continues for a little while. So after exercise, you continue to burn more calories. But with exercise, without really focusing on what you're eating, most people are going to transiently increase their food intake with exercise and decrease with a lack of exercise. So for the most part, people who are just sort of going with I eat when I'm hungry and I stop when I'm full. If they exercise more, they eat more. If they exercise less, they eat less. So what do you do to actually manage weight? Eat less, move more. In the article that you read, the Aragon article, they refer to this as CICO, the calories in, calories out. That is the basic law of thermodynamics here. So you take in energy and you expend energy. So if you look at the calories outside, thermic effect of food, and diet-induced thermogenesis, that accounts for 8 and 15% of your total daily energy expenditure. So 20 for protein, 25 to 30% of the calories from protein are used just to digest it. Carbohydrates, 6 to 8% of the calories are used to digest it. For fat, 5 to 15%, though that number is up for debate based on some more current research. So you can see that if you're someone who's counting your calories in and trying to count your calories out, that thermic effect of food, or also known as diet-induced thermogenesis, can make a big difference because if up to 30% of the calories from protein that you eat are used just to digest it, that's going to make a difference in what your energy out is compared to 6 to 8% of carbohydrates. Also, the refinement level of food can account for differences. So in the Aragon article, they talk about the cheese sandwich example. There's a cheese sandwich that's made with whole wheat bread and real cheese, and a sandwich made with processed white bread and processed cheese product. And the thermic effect of food for the whole wheat sandwich, it took 137 calories to digest it. And for the processed sandwich, it took 73 calories to digest it. So the refinement level of your food also makes a difference. In a hypocaloric state, so eating not as many calories as you expend, your resting metabolic rate tends to decrease. In a hypercaloric state, your resting metabolic rate tends to increase, but this is a somewhat lopsided control system. So the amount that your resting metabolic rate decreases in a hypocaloric state is not equal to the amount that it increases in a hypercaloric state. All this to say is that the math will never come out exactly right. So if you're someone who's really vigilantly tracking calories in, calories out, 3,500 calories equals a pound, I should be losing or gaining this much weight, it doesn't always come out right, or it's never going to come out exactly right. Your body will change the way that it's processing foods, how much it's storing, how much it's expending, depending on what you're eating, how you're eating, when you're eating, and so on. Because in general, your body wants to maintain homeostasis. It does not want to change. And genetically, there's some people who are hard gainers, so they seem to eat whatever they want, but they don't gain any weight. And there's people who are hard losers or hard maintainers that no matter what they do, their body tends to bounce them back to where they were or keep them from losing a good amount of weight in the first place. I want to talk about adaptive thermogenesis for a minute. So it said before, if you, in the example from that first slide, that if you were eating in excess 335 calories per day, then that would be over 30 pounds per year. But that's not what happens. It's about 2 pounds per year. If you have a decreased body weight, you have a decreased resting metabolic rate. So same goes for the opposite way. If you have an increased body weight, you have an increased resting metabolic rate. But when you lose weight, when your body weight decreases, that decrease in resting metabolic rate is not fully explained by just the decrease in body weight. I'm sorry, that's a typo there. That should say decrease in resting metabolic rate, not fully explained by decrease in body weight. there is a greater decrease in resting metabolic rate than just the body weight change would predict. If you have a 10% decrease in body weight, you actually get a 25% decrease in energy expenditure. And this is what you hear about the concept of your metabolism slows as you lose weight. That's true because you have not as large of a body, you don't have as much tissue that needs to be maintained, so your resting metabolic rate is going to go down. But this adaptive thermogenesis occurs beyond what you would expect because of that change in body size. People who lose a lot of weight, if they maintain their lean body mass, their metabolism does not slow as much. Their resting metabolic rate remains a little higher. Your book really just says that severe calorie restriction decreases resting metabolic rate. That's true, but all weight loss will decrease resting metabolic rate. The more somebody can maintain their lean mass, the more limited that decrease will be. So if you look at diet recommendations, recommend higher protein diets and doing a resistance training program to maintain lean mass and have a lower rate of the adaptive thermogenesis. So to recap, adaptive thermogenesis is that greater decrease that you see in resting metabolic rate beyond what would be expected just because of body weight change. When we talk about gaining lean mass, so that is a goal often of people who are trying to gain weight, but it's also a goal for people who are trying to lose weight. So how do you gain lean mass while still losing weight? You can gain lean mass while being in an underfed condition. So a hypocaloric, taking in fewer calories than you're expending, you can still gain lean mass. It's not going to be gained as well as in an overfed condition, so somebody who's taking in more calories than they're expending, as long as the protein level is adequate. So if you look at the Aragon article recommends 1.2 to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. If you're hitting that and somebody's doing resistance training program, you can still gain lean mass, though it's going to be greater in an overfed condition than an underfed condition. We talked about calories in, calories out, exercise activity thermogenesis versus non-exercise. If you're, what happens if you just reduce calories? What happens if you just add more exercise? What happens if you decrease your calories and add exercise? There are benefits to adding exercise there are benefits of adding exercise to caloric restriction. So if you look at this chart, the far left bar for each, the males and females, so females are on the right, males are on the left. The far left bar is the control group, so they didn't do anything different from what they were doing before. And you do see a decrease in some of those. If somebody goes into a study and then it's a study on weight loss, even if they're told not to change anything that they do, they're still going to be a little more conscious of what they do. So it's not surprising that they lose a little bit of weight. But the middle bar is folks who just reduced their calories. And the far right bar is those who reduced their calories and added exercise. So the goal was 12.5% 12.5% increase in energy expenditure from exercise and 12.5% increase in energy expenditure, or 12.5% decrease in the amount of calories taken in. The caloric restriction group was just decreasing caloric content by 25%. It's not really clear in this graph whether or not there was a significant difference between caloric restriction alone and caloric restriction plus exercise. But if you think about what we just talked about with maintaining lean body mass, the exercise and caloric restriction group is probably preferential because it will maintain lean mass and you'll have a lower rate of that adaptive thermogenesis. Also, there is some difference between males and females that they point out here, particularly in visceral adipose tissue, that adipose tissue that's surrounding the abdominal organs. You see a greater decrease in males than females. The amount that they had to begin with isn't really clear, so it's hard to really make anything of that. What are the recommendations for maintaining body weight, losing body weight, gaining body weight, so on? So this, what do you actually do to manage weight? If somebody's trying to lose weight, the recommendation is to try and obtain a 500 to 1,000 kilocalorie per day deficit. And you'll need to do some math because the goal would be about 0.5 to 1% of body weight per week. So if you take somebody who is about 75 kilos, they're going to be about 150 or so pounds. If you do 0.5 to 1%, so 1% of that would be 1.5 pounds per week. 0.5 would be even less. So it's really the slow, consistent decrease in weight is what makes somebody more likely to maintain their weight loss later on. And there's always going to be a faster decrease at the beginning of a diet and exercise program than later on in the program. The other recommendation is to increase that physical activity level to greater than 1.6. Remember, that's the ratio of basal metabolic rate to everything else. You want to try and increase the amount of calories that are being burned by non-exercise and exercise activity thermogenesis. Generally, it's agreed that we need to increase dietary protein. So the current recommendations are 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. What we keep seeing in the research is about 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day tends to maintain and increase lean body mass, which is beneficial from a health perspective and from maintaining that resting metabolic rate better, lower adaptive thermogenesis, and also maintaining strength and the other benefits of having more lean tissue. So along with that, you want to include resistance training in the exercise. You'll see different studies that say, resistance training plus aerobic training is better than aerobic training alone for weight loss. Those seem to be pretty consistent. So including resistance training in a weight loss program is beneficial. And a lot of different diets can be effective for weight loss. If you go back to the Aragon article and the discussion we had in class, there's no one magic diet. There's no one magic thing to change that's going to make somebody lose weight. There's a lot of different diets that can be effective. So you want to look at the patient-client preference. We'll talk about evidence-based practice. Remember, that's got 3 components to it. What does it say in the research? What are the patient-client values? And what is your clinical experience? So you've got to consider patient-client preference. What's their environment? What do they need to do every day? What diet is going to fit best for them? From the physical activity level thing, the PAL, I think it's a little difficult to understand and calculate, so I'm not sure that's something I would give as a recommendation to a client, but there are opportunities and ways to educate your clients on how to decrease their calorie intake, increase their calorie output, and hopefully be able to lose some weight. And then the opposite is true also. If you have someone who's very lean and frail, then you can still include resistance training, increase dietary protein, increase their total daily caloric intake, and help them to gain some healthy weight. Let's move on to the dimensions of wellness. So hopefully you've read the article already and also done the quiz. But remember the 7 dimensions of wellness. You have the physical, emotional, intellectual, social, spiritual, environmental, and occupational. And why do you care? This is not a specific area of expertise in physical therapy, but the benefit of paying attention to other components of wellness beyond the physical component can be really beneficial for patient or client. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg argument, so which came first, chicken or the egg? So you could say that improvement in dimensions of wellness other than the physical component may further improve physical function, or improvement in physical function may improve function in other dimensions. So really it's sort of a circular logic that if the physical dimension improves, then somebody's able to function better in the other dimensions, and feeling better in the other dimensions can make the physical dimension feel better. The long story short is you shouldn't ignore the other components of somebody's life, the other dimensions of their wellness, just because your expertise is in the physical dimension. So what do you actually recommend to a client? The first thing you have to do is learn something about them. So talk to your client, get to know them a little bit, know what their values are, know what their needs are, and try to start from there. There are also some global surveys that you can use. So the SF12 is a very short survey that just asks about how somebody is functioning in their daily life. There's also the SF36, which is much longer. It'll give you some more detailed information. And the Life H is another quality of life survey that can help you have an idea of how somebody's functioning in their daily life and their roles that they need to fulfill or want to fulfill. And you can use those to track changes over time, so you have some sort of data other than just what's changing physically with the client or what they say is feeling better or not. And don't be afraid to refer somebody out to other resources. So that's probably what a lot of what you'll end up doing with looking at other dimensions of wellness is referring people to resources that can be beneficial for them. So from the occupational wellness, if somebody is unemployed or they've lost their job or they're needing to change jobs, vocational rehab is a service that's provided to anyone who's needing to find employment, change employment, and so on. Vocational rehab helps people to find different employment, get training to find different employment, make them more qualified, and so on. Referral to mental health resources, so referral to a counselor or psychiatrist. Maybe somebody needs better stress management skills. They need to talk some stuff out to be able to have a better social wellness. A lot of benefit can come from somebody talking to a counselor, or if there's really some serious issues, and seeing a psychiatrist too. And spiritual resources, I'm not saying that you need to tell people that they should go to church and they just need a little more Jesus in their life. Trust me, I lived in the South and things like that happen, but that's probably going to be not allowed in your clinic setting. But spiritual resources such as recommending meditation, spending time in nature, doing something to care for your spirit, outside of just what are you doing to maintain your physical wellness. All right, that's all we have for today. We're going to have a conversation in class about what this PowerPoint was about. Then also we're going to talk about a project that you have coming up that you'll work on during lab time, and we'll also review for the exam, which is going to be next Tuesday. All right, have a great rest of the day.